Part of the goal of our institute has been to try to explore disability from all of the theological disciplines and perspectives, and to gradually build up online and in audio form a library of resources that look at disability not through just special education, or not just through religious education, or not just through theology, or not just through pastoral care, but through all of the theological disciplines that are parts of all the faith traditions. So to do that, one of the ones we haven't done yet has to do with evangelism and outreach. Now, that's not a particularly easy theme to think about when, in fact, we've scheduled and titled and worked on this week being an interfaith dialogue about disability and what it means for us. So my thinking about this, and the part of the title was the question of who saves who. I could probably say the whole talk in relationship to many of the profound thoughts that have been said this week, which simply by saying, in relation to the ways we've used the word other, both with small o and capital O, that none of us saves ourselves. We're always saved by an other, and you can decide whether that's a small o or a large O. And probably the rest is history, or is in the details. But as we've gathered this week to learn from others about the meaning of their experience in theological and spiritual frameworks, and with many different answers to some of the questions or conundrums that come from this, and to use your words, we need to think about what, especially as Christians, I think one of the primary calls and parts of many of our traditions about what evangelism means through the lens of disability, and through those of us who've worked in interfaith and ecumenical and secular positions, often with people with disabilities and their families. Now, to go back to the beginning of the week with Hans's first introduction, let me start from my own experience and tell you some of my credentials for this. I grew up a Southern Baptist missionary kid in Nigeria, so I know something about missionary work and evangelism, but thank God my dad was a doctor. But I grew up, first words I could say, probably besides mother and I'm hungry, were probably reciting John 3:16. For God so loved the world, and grew up singing songs over and over again at devotionals in our boarding school. Songs like "We've a story to tell to the nations," a story of, faith and might, a story, those old evangelical marching songs about what we needed to do. And then I came back to the States as a junior in high school with the words of Raymond, a steward at our boarding school, ringing in my ear in 1963, when the pictures on the papers in Nigeria had been pictures of Bull Connor and the German Shepherd dogs in Birmingham fighting or trying to put down the demonstrations that were happening there. And Raymond and I got into intellectual discussions there, and one of the things he said to me was, "How can you be here when that's going on there? How can you be here in Nigeria when that is going on there in terms of the ways people who are black are being treated in the U.S.?" And as I started searching for my own identity about which country I belong to, whose am I, where did I belong, and found my passion and call in another foreign land, so to speak, when I was invited or ordered against my will by my CPE supervisor to go and work in a clinic with families with intellectually disabled and developmentally disabled children, or mentally retarded, as we called it in those days. I began to hear these stories from families about their rejection, stories that rankled my skin, raised my skin, and and bristled me up in many ways and revived, of course, this old missionary spirit within me about can do, by golly, we can do something about this. We can do something about this, which led to being a chaplain of a large upstate old facility in New York, where the key to my ministry became the whole symbols for me of celebration and belonging. In a place where there were 1,400 people in the space there had once been 5,000, where a room like this would be called a bedroom with 50 beds, with no partitions between the rooms, and no place for people to keep their possessions, where people who were there, for me it's simply how could we let them celebrate, let them know they were valued in God's eyes, and how could we, in that kind of place, create any kind of sense of belonging or membership to some place or some community other than being a resident at Newark State School, or as some would say, an inmate at Newark State School. And so my first sermon adapted the hermeneutical structure of my father's talks as a missionary doctor when he would come back to churches and talk about his work in a foreign land. And the title of my first sermon to use in other churches was So Near Yet So Far, a report from a foreign land. That in this town of Newark, New York, not New Jersey, Newark, New York, a village of about 10,000 people with this old institution up on the top of the hill. You know, the distance, the psychological distance between the top of that hill and the Baptist church in the village, which could have been 1,000 or 2,000 miles. And part of our job became to say, how can we bridge that distance and help get people there? And there were ways we began to do that. Simply with things like taking a birthday card to people who had never received a birthday card in their life. And when the birthday cards came out that had music in them, I thought I was in chaplaincy heaven, because at least they could sing, because I never could. But I began to err as this Protestant chaplain, because as you began to look for concrete, specific ways to help people feel like they were loved and included, I began to do things like, the Catholic priest gets a lot of response on Ash Wednesday because it's a concrete symbolic act that people can do and know something. And pretty soon, the next year, this Baptist minister started doing Ash Wednesday services with the Catholic priest. And but I would never say from dust to dust. When people would come, I would say, Jesus loves you. Jesus loves you. And I never forget the one person who came up in the line one time, and as I started to reach and put the sign of the ashes on her forehead, she said, "Don't burn me up. Don't burn me up." But those concrete physical acts where people could feel through music, through song, through shared communion, acts of feeling included and celebrated. And then moving from there to as Protestant chaplain to being the coordinator of religious services for another facility where I worked with Jewish, Catholic, and Protestant groups. And I would say to you over time, and some of you have seen some of the things that have come out of this, I would say that almost without a doubt, my most sacred and holy moments have come in the midst of other religious traditions than my own. Hear that again. My most sacred moments have come in the midst of other religious traditions than my own, other than perhaps walking into St. Peter's or some other kinds of places like that. And I also, in that institution, though, also had to defend an evangelical group against the professional staff who were on call and came by on Wednesday nights when they were there for a Bible study on Wednesday nights, when if I sat in with that group, what they were teaching from their version of the First Bible Baptist Church of Rochester, New York, would make my theological skin crawl, but the doctrine stuff just went right over the tops of the heads of people. They came with refreshments, they came with music, and by God, they were there every Wednesday night. and that provided a group of people who were friends who gathered together in community. So what I had to say to the social workers and the psychologists and others, don't think about that doctrine. It's not going to make that much difference to people there, but see what they're doing, see what they're embodying. And as my journey continued to work with the Journal of Religion, Disability, and Health, and working in the areas of cultural competence, and working more, one of my roles over the years has been really to work with a ministry, I would call it, with non-practicing professionals and others in the field. I've sometimes defined my role as an assertive or sometimes aggressive presence, spiritual presence in a secular world, and trying to be an advocate for paying attention to the spiritual needs and gifts of people. I've also discovered that some of those families and some of those advocates who never grace the door of a church anymore partly because of the wounds they found there early on, that some of those people are the most spiritual people that I have ever known, and some of the most ethical and beautiful and spirit-filled people. And that there are beautiful stories in every single faith tradition of membership, not just inclusion, but of membership, and awful stories in every faith tradition about exclusion and wounding. If I'm going to believe my New Testament Baptist roots, who say to missionaries, by your fruits you shall know them, then I end up in a position where I cannot say that Jesus is the only way. I cannot say, honestly, that Jesus is the only way. My definition of my job has become, how do I help each person, each tradition, each person from each tradition find their own spiritual home and be a member in that home and included, welcomed, recognized, and celebrated for who they are. My friend Mike Miles, or he just goes by Miles in the UK, and if you want to read anything about the role of attitudes of other faith traditions towards people with disabilities, Google M. Miles, and he's the most consummate researcher in the world about attitudes towards disability in historical perspectives by Buddhism, Islam, Hinduism, just incredible stuff, the annotated bibliographies he has done. And we put together a collection of his articles for one of the double issues of the journal. And one of those articles I had seen early in my career where he and his wife were working in the district in the province of, I don't know if I'm going to say this right, but Waziristan, I believe. It's the northwestern province of Pakistan where all the Taliban folks have been and where the Americans have been droning and bombing people, very conservative area. And he and his wife had been sent by CMS from the UK to work with kids and with families with kids with developmental disabilities. And you can imagine what they got was, you're just doing this to convert us, to make us Christian. And he finally developed a response that was, no, I'm not. I'm here to make you better Muslims. Because by my reading of the Quran, you wouldn't let people with disabilities sit in the corner and rot. And so my job is to help make you better Muslims, not necessarily to make you Christians. And so when people ask me about how I see my long-term ministry, I say, well, and they ask about this Christian thing, I say, well, when every tradition and every denomination has reached the point where everybody's included and everybody belongs, then we can turn the discussion to who's right or who's wrong, or who's better than another. And I have a feeling that'll be a long time from now. So it is a first step of saying, how do we work within our own traditions and with every tradition to move that movement of belonging and of membership and that sense of being part of, beyond inclusion. Last year, you would be interested, our theme was beyond inclusion to belonging was kind of the theme of the conference. And of course, one of the best things we could do about disability issues would simply be to help people within their own faith traditions to stop killing one another or maiming one another. That would be one way to start in some ways. So that's kind of the first place where I come from in terms of my own experience and journey. The second implication for me about evangelism comes from what we've done all week. We've spent a lot of time thinking and are seeing the passion and the ways in which we look for people to look past labels or help people to see themselves as more than their labels, beyond fear, beyond stereotypes, beyond prejudice, to see past this unclear screen that Judith Snow so profoundly talked about the other day, about seeing her image not in an unfocused way, but focused as a beloved person in God's family, and how the use of labels and the ways people, the stares, the fear, the anxiety, the pushes us back away, and which communicates what Bob Persky so brilliantly said to one parent a number of years ago. He said, or another parent said to another parent, he said, "Can't you see it's we who tell other people they're a tragedy? It's we who tell other people they're a tragedy." We can argue with the use of that word, tragedy, but it's our attitudes towards other people that reinforce the sense of maybe that what has happened towards them is some kind of tragedy or some kind of punishment or something where somebody was in to get them. And when we've talked about those screens and projections of our fears, like Jeremy talked about in this book about Isaiah's suffering servant, and when you read those passages in Isaiah about the ways people project the fears of a society on this person who was without form and ugly and without shape, that we should fear him, and we place all of our fears upon him. And we've worked with the role of labels this week. One of my sort of favorite ways of working with that goes with a couple of word plays about the power of expectations. And one of them is that I am not who I think I am, and I'm not who you think I am, but I often am who I think you think I am. You know, that I often become the person who you think I am. And some of us spend too much of our lives trying to figure out what people want of us and try to be that person. That's a sign of maturity. There's a flip side to that gets into the projections that we do, which is that you're not who you think you are, and you're not who I think you are, but you often are who I think you are, so I can be who I think I am. Got that? You're not who you think you are, you're not who I think you are, but I often make you into that person that I think you are, so I can be who I think I am. Otherwise called the foil we were talking about this week, that you make this person into this person so I can be the person that I think I am, that I can be the so-called normal person as opposed to people who are limited or fragile or vulnerable, that I can be strong in opposition to people who are weak, or I can be right in relationship to people who are wrong. The other becomes the foil. And so the question I have to ask all of us as people in disability and theology and ministry, if we spend 95% of the passion and energy of our lives in trying to help others move past the othering of people with disabilities, the othering by expectations, norms, diagnoses, projections, how can I then turn and make someone from a different faith tradition into another? It doesn't work. It's a schizophrenic move, I would say. It's just, in some ways, to use that word perhaps as a metaphorical way, it doesn't work for me anymore. I can't do that. I literally can't do that. We don't make that person from an other tradition evil, but we make them lost. Perhaps we don't make them, our attitude's not pity, but they're unsaved. Our attitude may be that they're maybe not dangerous, but they're unable to see our light or to see the truth or to understand that which we think is obvious. It becomes the issue for me of practicing what we preach in one area of our lives and applying that to others. My friend Donna at that Newark State School many years ago, when the first group home was being opened, and the rustle and the commotion in the village of Newark about that, she said to me, "Bill, the question is, when will normal people learn to accept handicapped people the same way handicapped people have to learn to accept normal people?" And you could ask that question in every other, when will whites learn to accept blacks in the same way that blacks have had to learn to accept whites? Any majority-minority thing, you get this acceptance becomes mixed up with power and structure and control, and you really begin to see what is the kind of lens through which we see things. And if you, in the area of cultural competence, if you have one of the classic documents is online called Unpacking the White Knapsack, which asks us as white people or Caucasian people to unpack that pack of assumptions that we carry around with us about the way in which the world is structured and in comparison to ways others may see the world. So practicing what we preach about welcoming and seeing the other as a guest and a gift and a child of God. The third implication we've talked a lot about this week has to do with hospitality to the stranger. And for me, that's become the foundation of ministries with people with disabilities or by, that it's not special ministries to so-called special people, but it's ministries and often that we are called to the fundamental tradition in all three, Buddhism, Islam, and Judaism and Christianity, but also in Hinduism and in every other major faith tradition in the world, there are two common themes. There's one that's, every one of them has got something that looks like the golden rule, and every one of them has a tradition of hospitality to the stranger as fundamental to who they are and what that faith tradition is. My friend Parker Palmer was the one who really first introduced this to me, or spelled it out for me in a conference we did in Rochester in 1987. And his keynote address is on the Summer Institute website under other presentations. And for me, it's one of those classics that I go back to over and over again. And he did what we've often done here, said the host is not necessarily doing the guest a favor, really the host is the one receiving the guest. Why? And he tries to translate the call to hospitality into our modern terms by three reasons. He says we're called to welcome the guest, and the other because we're all strangers to each other. And if the world is not safe for me as a stranger, then it's not going to be safe for you. So hospitality, first of all, is an act of self-preservation. As it was in the desert many years ago, if you could not count on being welcomed and getting some water from somebody else, that's a call for you to welcome someone else for some water and food, because otherwise they didn't have Motel 6s and other places where you could get that kind of refreshment. Your life depended upon it. And I would submit that our lives depend upon that in some ways now. Secondly, Parker said the reason the stranger is so important to us in hospitality is that it saves us from one of the greatest evils of today's world, which is boredom. That sameness is really boring. Sameness is really boring. And to be with the same group of people who are, quote, just like us all the time is really boring. The same food all the time is boring. You know, think of the ways in which none of us would want to give up the kind of diversity of cuisines that's evident in 10 blocks around here. And I've just moved to Texas, where I'm afraid I'm going to be challenged by cuisine because there's not much there besides Tex-Mex and hamburger joints and barbecue. So missing my Thai, my biggest grief in this move is going to be coming from missing my Thai and Indian and other kinds of restaurants. But think about that. And Parker goes on to say that lots of young people, he thinks the reason they turn to violence in this world is because they're bored. And so when you're bored, you strike out and you do something to get attention or to make something happen. So how could we help people learn to welcome each other? And third, he says we need many eyes to see the truth. The truth is not one-dimensional. You need many different sets of eyes to look at the same thing. And the vision from other people often sends us into new understandings. But to follow up on a little bit what John was said, and I'm sorry I missed some of what you said, but the disciples, you remember, were sent out 2 by 2 with no travel budget, no expense account. They had to depend upon being invited by other people. And so not only are there guidelines for host, but I submit there are probably a lot of guidelines for guest and for being a guest in somebody's house. And when we depend upon the hospitality of others, we're guests, we don't. The number one rule my mom told me and taught me about going to somebody else's house is don't make a mess, and certainly don't take over the house as if it is your own. And that is so often what we have done as Christians when we have been invited into other people's cultures and traditions, that we have taken over the house and said somehow or another, your house doesn't have the right kind of decoration or refreshments. And the way I can talk about that is when we as a kid used to go with my parents to small villages way out in what was called the bush in Nigeria, and be welcomed into a city, into a town where all the young kids would come running after us saying, Oyibo, 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 which was their label for other. The white person was other, and Oyibo was the label to the only way they could describe that in their understanding was, who the hell is this white person? Why are they white? And the word literally meant peeled one. That to understand black people, you were a black person who'd been peeled, because underneath that skin there is pink, and that's where we have been peeled. Literally, that's the way they would understand that. Just like when you hear some crazy white people think black people come from being out in the sun too long, or something that's the kind of opposite of that. But in those little villages, we'd be invited to the chief's hut after the service, and what would we be served? Because they wanted to bring out the best, was a warm Coca-Cola. A warm Coca-Cola, a ubiquitous Coca-Cola everywhere, even into the little villages. And to serve what would be considered the best was to bring out a warm Coca-Cola. They felt like they had to give us that was something that was familiar to us. And one of the things Parker says in this presentation is using the phrase is either Ephesians, I think, where we say as Christians, in Christ there is no East or West, no Jew or Greek, male or female, slave or free. He says, I think we've interpreted that the wrong way as Christians, that what we think it means is that in Christ we're all going to be alike and there's no difference. And rather what Parker submits that is what that phrase might mean is that if I am truly in Christ, then I can accept you for who you are, that your label, whatever that is not going to make any difference to me. There are no more binary distinctions like that of either or, that if I am in Christ, I can accept you in the wholeness of who you are and allow you to be that person and meet you in that space. It goes back to a phrase that I thought was medieval Christian, but it turned out to have been first coming out of some of the rabbinates in Europe during the Middle Ages, a phrase that says simply, in front of every person there's a host of angels saying, make way for the image of God. In front of every person there's a host of angels saying, make way for the image of God. So if we believed that about every person who we included into a space or had access to a space with that sense that here also is one of God's images, as Judith so profoundly talked about the other day, in front of every person, make way for the image of God, then the question becomes, how do we learn? The question becomes for me, how do we learn to embrace the stranger? John noted it's often like a dance. It is a dance, and it's not too often our embrace, as Miroslav Volf so wonderfully points out in his book on exclusion and embrace, what he calls the dance of embrace. Too often we go towards open arms towards other people who are open towards us, and we just roll right over them, or go and hug them when they're nowhere near ready to be hugged, or to be patted on the head, because you happen to be in a wheelchair or on something like that. That often we want to help before people have had a chance to tell us their story and who they are. And these days in the States, if you do that too quickly, in some settings, especially with men versus women, you're in real trouble as in terms of, and also across cultures in terms of violating personal space and senses of that. But that, and the dance of embrace for Volf is to move towards, but then the second step is to drop your hands, step back, and then let whatever discussion needs to happen between us so I get to know you, and then we get to a point perhaps where the embrace or the handshake is a genuine act of mutuality and of partnership. The sharing of vulnerability. The sharing of vulnerability about who and why I am. In the dance of hospitality, we have to let each other in. We have to let each other in, if you want to look at it in that way. And then the fourth implication for me about this leads us to back to the question and the issue and the primacy of identity, about who are you? Who am I? Why do what I do? And in that same video, Parker says that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities do us a favor by puncturing our illusions about who we are. And he said, if you think about the word disillusioned, that it really is used probably perhaps in the wrong way, just like the word handicap. That someone to become disillusioned means that they're getting rid of an illusion, and perhaps then closer to the truth. And so he has a wonderful line in which he says, my teachers and my family and my children often say I disillusioned them. And he wishes he could get to the point where as a teacher and a mentor, when somebody comes to him and says, oh, I'm really feeling disillusioned today, he as a teacher could say, great, can I help you have another disillusioning experience? So therefore you might move closer to the truth and what really is true and what's really core. And he talks about the illusions that are punctured in terms of the illusions that we think we know who we are totally, or we think we know who somebody else is totally. Think about our assessments and diagnostic processes and multidisciplinary assessments. And that could be labeled as the long-time sin of omniscience, that we think we know everything about ourselves or others. The illusion that we can fix or control everything, which is the kind of classic illusion of our time. It was an illusion of mind that got punctured by my depression. I told the story in the small group the other day, and I'll share it here, that one of the things that happened the first time when I was in the hospital, and my wife took my son to a therapist to give Matthew a chance to talk about what was going on with his dad, and Beverly introduced it by saying, this depression's kind of got a hold of Dad. It's sort of like a demon and won't let him go. And my son, who has the liability of having grown up in the house with a New Testament professor and a preacher or a chaplain, he's very witty, as quick as a blink said, well, there's too bad there's not a herd of pigs around when you need one. Which is one of the most redemptive stories for me out of that journey, because he was exactly right. If I could just have a herd of pigs and can get that demon out and throw them over the cliff when we need one, if I had that kind of control, boy, would that not be nice? Would that not be nice? And that illusion of that we can fix or control, which is the illusion of omnipotence, that we are omnipotent, not that God is. And then the illusion that we will never suffer diminishment, just like you so wonderfully said. The question about disability is not whether, but when, and how we deal with our own fragility and vulnerability. In 1994, Rabbi Ed Friedman, who was a Jewish rabbi who's famous for his book on generations and family systems, did a talk at a chaplaincy conference in the States called Togetherness and Stuck Togetherness, the Importance of Leadership. Togetherness and stuck togetherness. And it was an extended fable between Satan and an interview with a pastoral counselor, him the rabbi. And in this extended interview, fantasy interview with Satan, Satan was describing all the ways in which he was using pastoral counselors to extend his own means and reach with people. And by persuading pastoral counselors that they in fact knew everything about somebody else or could fully describe somebody, or that they had the right technique, or if just this new technique would help to fix somebody, or that counselors refused to talk at all about their own fragility, about their own vulnerability, about the fact that they too were not immortal in different ways. And all of that, he said it in a completely humorous way. It's not online. I'm going to see if we can get it online or a place, because it's a wonderful fable. It's a wonderful fable, very funny but very poignant. But his key point was, and it's something that's come up this week here at times, is that in pursuit of community, we cannot give up our individuality, our leadership, our particularity, our definition of knowing who we are, but in pursuit of our particularity and our own identity of ourselves, neither can we give up the fact that we're dependent and interdependent with other people. The paradox is how can you do both? How can you do both? Not be an independently particular person, unique for who you are, but also be in community without having that identity submerged, forgotten, passed over in different kinds of ways and other kinds of ways, so that your identity is totally submerged in some form of identity that's supposed to be normal or the majority or whatever. We cannot be in community, really, if I'm not clear about who I am and also who others are in that community. Not in his talk, but Parker in another discussion with me once in a small talk I heard said, if you want to define community, community is the place where that one person we would rather not have there happens to be. The community means that, when we say, oh, we'd be a community except for that person. Well, that person is in God's community. And the corollary to that is, as soon as that person leaves, somebody will automatically take their place, which says something about the human need to scapegoat somebody and make somebody the problem for the rest of us not getting along or for not being in community. So we've got to be clear about who we are and to understand, appreciate, before we can really collaborate and partner with others in other kinds of ways. But there's a new book that explores this dimension by another person coming out of an evangelical background. A key voice who's what is called the emerging church. I don't know if you know Brian McLaren or if you've read Brian McLaren or listened to him. But his new book is called Why Did Jesus, Moses, the Buddha, and Muhammad Cross the Road? Why did Jesus, Moses, the Buddha, and Muhammad crossed the road? And it wasn't to go to the Queen and Beaver pub over on Elm Street or to go into the bar. But the question he's asking in this book is, why do we assume that to be a strong Christian means being hostile to other faith traditions? Why is that the popular understanding of Christianity? And that and if you happen to be benevolent and welcoming of other traditions, then you're assumed that you're a weak Christian, or your Christianity is not strong. And he says it's one of those books that is not about disability at all. It's about the ways in which we other folks from different faith traditions, and yet it's all about the issues we've been talking about this week. You see it on every page. In fact, one of the things I wrote to him and said, you only have the word disability one place in this book, but the whole book is about that. The whole book is about that. And we tried to get him for this week, or even to do an interview to talk about it. But the book is about our need to categorize and the need to be clear about who we are and our passions without a deficit-based approach to other people. So what he's asking is, can we not be strong in our identity, but also strong in our benevolence? Can you make those two together strong? You need to go down. I want to give you the space. Okay, fine. I'm almost done. Okay. So what he said is, how can we become people who are seen as strong and benevolent, also clear and open, committed and welcoming? Why did Jesus, Moses, the Buddha, and Muhammad cross the road? Can you imagine one of them seeing the other on this other side of the road and not cross the road to go talk to them? And think of that image of them going to talk to each other, and then the image of the four of them, he asked in his book, think of what would happen if the four of them then went down that road, encountering people with needs and struggles in our societies, and were able to work together with their respective gifts and traditions and address and the issues of the suffering and the issues of marginalization and exclusion together in this world. And let then people decide, and perhaps we could get them first to address the issues of disability together. That was part of the vision of this conference, that through the arena of disability, perhaps we can build new arenas of understanding and collaboration. So the image of for me, is the kind of outreach and the kind of evangelism that I think I am called to, and perhaps you are as well. I am not so much saved forever as I am forever being saved. I'm not so much saved forever as forever being saved. My favorite benediction from my pastor in high school was, "Depart now in the fellowship of the Lord your God, and as you go, remember that in the goodness of God you were born into this world. By the grace of God you've been kept all the day long, even until this hour. And by the love of God fully revealed in the one we call Jesus, you and I are being redeemed." Are being redeemed. W.H. Auden said it in the poem and book, For the Time Being. What do we do for the time being? Between now and as Christians, the day when Jesus comes again. And for the time being, he is the way. Seek him in the land of unlikeness, and you will meet rare beasts and have unique adventures. He is the truth. Seek him in the kingdom of anxiety, and you will come to a city that's expected your return for years. He is the life. Seek him in the world of the flesh, the concrete encounters of the ways in which we build community. And at your marriage, and perhaps at your conference, all its occasions shall dance for joy. Thank you.